At a luxury vacation with his fiancée, a Korean mafia boss freezes by a call. His ex is in labor with quadruplets. He divorced her 8 months ago because she couldn't give him children. Now, at a luxury island resort with his new fiancée, one phone call shatters his perfect facade. His ex-wife is in labor with quadruplets, 4 children he never knew existed. She hid the pregnancy after he humiliated and rejected her, carrying his sons and daughters in silence while he moved on with someone younger, someone fertile. Now the Korean mafia boss who controls shipping routes across 2 continents is racing against time to reach the woman he destroyed before she disappears with his children forever. This is the story of a man who traded love for power and lost everything that mattered. The infinity pool at Isola Verde reflected the late afternoon sun like liquid gold. Taehyung Chung stood at the edge of paradise, champagne in hand, his fiancée Soyeon laughing beside him, elegant, 24, everything he'd convinced himself he needed. His empire stretched across East Asia and into Europe. His name made politicians nervous and rivals disappear. This vacation was his victory lap. But when his phone vibrated against the marble table, something ancient and terrified stirred in his chest. Unknown number. International. He almost ignored it. He didn't. Mr. Chong. The voice was professional but tight with urgency. This is St. Bridget's Medical Center in Marseille. You're listed as the emergency contact for Alma Mensa. The name hit him like a blade between the ribs. Alma. 8 months since he'd signed the divorce papers without meeting her eyes. 8 months since he'd told her she was defective. 8 months since he'd convinced himself walking away was necessary. Why are you calling me? His voice was ice, but his hands weren't steady. She's in active labor. Quadruplets. 31 weeks. There are complications. The world stopped spinning. What did you say? Quadruplets, Mr. Chong. She's asking for. That's not possible. But even as he said it, he was calculating. 8 months ago. The divorce. The timing. She refused to name another contact, sir. We need. He didn't hear the rest. The phone nearly slipped from his grip. Quadruplets. His. They had to be his. 8 months ago, he'd sat across from her in their sole apartment, her hand resting unconsciously over her stomach, a gesture he'd found pathetic then. He'd told her coldly, rehearsed like a business transaction, that a man in his position needed heirs. That 5 years of failed treatments were proof her body had failed them both. She'd looked at him like he'd murdered something sacred between them. And she'd walked out without crying, without begging, without giving him the satisfaction of her breakdown. He'd forced himself not to follow. She must have already known. She'd been pregnant when he called her worthless, when he told her she was replaceable, when he looked at her like she was nothing. And she'd let him destroy her anyway, protecting something he hadn't known existed. Where is she? He demanded, already moving toward the villa, his driver appearing instantly. Marseille, but Mr. Chong, she's refusing. He ended the call. Behind him, Soyeon's crystalline laughter floated through the perfect afternoon. The resort stretched out like a postcard of the life he'd constructed, beautiful, controlled, utterly hollow. He didn't look back. The private jet cut through the darkening sky like a bullet. Taehyung sat rigid in the leather seat, his empire bleeding at the edges, his phone exploding with messages from Sung-ho warning him about rivals, about boundaries being tested, about the cost of this absence. He turned the phone off. The rage came first, hot and familiar. How dare she hide his children? How dare she deny him his heirs? But underneath the rage was something colder, sharper, more devastating. Shame. She'd been carrying 4 lives when he told her she was broken. When he chose Soyeon's youth over Alma's humanity. When he prioritized image over the woman who'd loved him when he was still learning to be more than his father's weapon. For 5 years, she'd apologized for her body. For 5 years, he'd let her believe the failure was hers. And the moment she discovered the miracle, she'd chosen to protect those children from him. The city lights below looked like dying embers. He'd built an empire on ruthless decisions, on knowing when to cut losses, on never looking back. But tonight, Flying toward the woman he'd discarded and 4 children he'd never known existed, Taehyung Chang realized something that shattered him completely. He'd been looking back every single day. He just hadn't been honest enough to admit it. Marseille's night air hit him like a judgment. St. Bridget's medical center loomed ahead, sterile white against the darkness. His bodyguards flanked him instinctively, but he waved them back. This wasn't a battlefield he could intimidate his way through. The maternity ward smelled like antiseptic and terror. A nurse looked up as he approached, her eyes widening at the sight of him. Expensive suit, dangerous presence, the kind of man who didn't belong in a place meant for beginnings. Alma Mensa, he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual command. Room number. The nurse hesitated. Sir, she's in active labor. Family only. I'm the father. Something in his face must have convinced her. Room 612. But sir, she's been very clear she doesn't want. He was already moving. His heart was a war drum. His hands were steady, but his breathing wasn't. He'd faced down rivals, survived assassination attempts, buried men who'd crossed him. But walking toward room 612, Taehyung Chang had never been more terrified in his life. The door was partially open. Through it, he could see her. Alma Mensa, hair braided tight against her skull, skin gleaming with sweat, her body curved protectively around 4 lives he'd never known existed. A nurse held her hand. No husband. No family. No one but her and the children she'd protected from him. He pushed the door open. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw everything he'd destroyed. But to understand how a man capable of controlling empires became powerless in a hospital room, we need to go back. Back to the moment everything shattered. Back to the day Alma Mensa made a choice that would change everything. Hello everyone. I'm back with another Afro-Korean story that will absolutely tease you emotionally. Before we continue, help me reach 2,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you these powerful journeys of love, redemption, and second chances. Now let's dive into this story. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. 8 months earlier, in Seoul. The apartment had never felt colder. Alma stood by the window overlooking the Han River, her hand resting unconsciously over her stomach, a new habit, barely 2 days old. Behind her, Taehyung's voice was steady, rehearsed, the tone he used when making business decisions. A man in my position needs heirs, Alma. 5 years is long enough. She'd known this conversation was coming. Had felt it building in his silences, in the way he'd stopped touching her after the last failed treatment, in how he'd started taking calls from matchmakers his family recommended. We could try again, she said quietly, still facing the window. I'm done trying. His words were surgical. Clean cuts designed not to leave scars, but to sever completely. Your body has made its limitations clear. For heartbeats, she thought. For impossible miracles you'll never know about. The doctor's voice still echoed in her mind from 2 days before. Quadruplets, Ms. Mensa. Spontaneous. We've never seen anything like this after your history. It's extraordinary. She'd sat in that examination room, staring at the ultrasound screen, watching 4 tiny hearts flutter like promises. And she'd known, with the clarity that comes from survival, that Taehyung Chang could never know. Not the man who'd just called her defective. Not the man whose empire devoured everything soft. Not the man who saw children as heirs, not lives. I'll have my lawyer send the papers, he continued. You'll be taken care of financially. I'm not cruel, Alma. She almost laughed. Instead, she turned to face him one last time, memorizing the man she'd loved before power had consumed him completely. His jaw was set, his eyes already distant, already moving toward whatever future he'd constructed without her. You're right, Alma said softly. You're not cruel. Cruel men feel something. She walked out of their apartment that afternoon and never looked back. At Marseille, 6 months later. The neonatal unit at St. Bridget's had become Alma's sanctuary and her mirror. She moved through the ward with practiced efficiency, her scrub stretched tight over her swollen belly, her hands gentle with the premature babies fighting for life in their incubators. The other nurses had stopped asking about the father. They'd learned to recognize the particular silence of women protecting their children from dangerous men. Alma had rebuilt her life one careful brick at a time. A modest apartment near the hospital. Shifts that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. A new identity constructed from the pieces of who she'd been before Taehyung Chang had convinced her she was broken. But fear was her constant companion. She checked her phone obsessively, terrified of seeing his name. She avoided Korean restaurants, Korean markets, anywhere his world might accidentally intersect with hers. At night, she lay awake feeling 4 lives swimming inside her, wondering if love alone would be enough to protect them. He has connections everywhere, she reminded herself. Money. Power. If he finds out. She never finished that thought. Present day, at St. Bridget's Medical Center. The first contraction hit during her shift. Alma gripped the edge of an incubator, her breath catching as pain radiated through her body. Too early. 31 weeks. Quadruplets couldn't come this early. Alma? Her colleague Marie was at her side instantly. Mon Dieu, you're. Call obstetrics, Alma managed. Now. The labor progressed too fast, too violently. Within an hour, she was in a delivery room, alarms screaming, doctors speaking in the urgent shorthand of emergencies. We need consent for emergency cesarean, someone said. Who do we call? No one. Alma's voice was fierce despite the pain tearing through her. I consent. Only me. Ms. Mensah, hospital policy requires. I said no one. But her body was betraying her, complications mounting, for lives hanging in a balance only surgery could restore. The head nurse leaned close, her voice gentle but firm. Alma, there's an emergency contact in your file. From the intake form. Taehyung Chang. Should we? No. Tears streamed down Alma's face, fear and pain and fury mixing together. Don't call him. Please. He can't. Another contraction seized her, so powerful she couldn't breathe. The doctors exchanged glances. Call him, the lead obstetrician said quietly. And in that moment, as her body fought to bring 4 lives into the world too soon, Alma Mensah whispered to herself, a promise, a prayer, a declaration of war. I will not let him take them. The pilot didn't ask questions when Taehyung Chang ordered the jet prepared for immediate departure. Men in his position didn't explain their emergencies, they simply expected the world to accommodate them. Within 40 minutes, the Gulf Stream was tearing through the night sky, Isola Verde disappearing behind them like a broken promise. Soyeon had called 17 times. Taehyung turned his phone face down on the leather armrest and watched the ocean far below, black and endless. She would be confused, then hurt, then angry. His associates would speculate. Tomorrow, the rumors would start, the great Taehyung Chang abandoning his engagement celebration, his carefully constructed future, for reasons no one could fathom. Let them wonder. His mind was a war zone. The rage came first, familiar and hot, the emotion he'd learned to weaponize since childhood. She hid this from me. For children. His blood. His legacy. Everything he'd told her she couldn't give him, and she'd been carrying them all along. For 8 months, she'd let him believe the lie while his heirs grew in secret, protected by her silence and his ignorance. How dare she? His hand curled into a fist against the armrest. Every instinct screamed to call his lawyers, to mobilize his network, to remind Alma Mensah that men like him didn't lose, they took what belonged to them. But underneath the rage, something colder was rising. Shame. The memory surfaced like a knife through water, sharp and unavoidable. Alma standing in their sole apartment, her hand over her stomach, she was already pregnant, her face heartbreakingly calm as he called her a liability. As he told her 5 years of trying had proven her body defective. As he explained, with the clinical detachment of a business transaction, that she was replaceable. Your body has made its limitations clear. His own words echoed back to him now, each syllable a small violence. She'd been pregnant with quadruplets, a medical miracle, and he'd called her barren. She'd been carrying the heirs he demanded, and he'd told her she was worthless. And she'd said nothing. She'd protected those children from him before they'd even drawn breath. Taehyung's reflection stared back at him from the jet's window, and he barely recognized the man looking back. When had he become someone a woman needed to hide her pregnancy from? When had he become the threat instead of the protector? "I'm not cruel, Amma," he'd said that day. God, he'd actually believed it. His phone buzzed. Sung-ho's name flashed across the screen. Taehyung answered. "Where are you?" His second-in-command's voice was tight with controlled panic. "The Kim syndicate hit one of our warehouses in Busan 2 hours ago. The Yakuza are testing our Seoul territories. Your absence is being noticed, and they're interpreting it as weakness. Handle it." "Taehyung, I can't, this requires your presence. If you don't return immediately, we're looking at a full-scale territorial war. Everything you've built." I said handle it. Silence. Then, carefully, "Where are you going?" "Marseille." "France?" Sung-ho's confusion bled through. "Why would you?" A pause. "This is about her, isn't it? The ex-wife?" Taehyung closed his eyes. His empire was fracturing. Rivals were circling like sharks scenting blood. Years of strategic positioning, brutal negotiations, calculated violence, all of it collapsing because he'd chosen to chase a ghost across continents. "She's having my children," he said quietly. "Then send lawyers. Send money. Send me if you want. But you can't abandon everything for." "I already did." The words came out hollow. 8 months ago, I abandoned everything that mattered. I'm just realizing it now. You're not making sense. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe walking away from an empire for a woman who hated him, for children who would never know his name, for a chance at redemption he probably didn't deserve, maybe all of it was insanity. "If I lose everything," Taehyung said, "then I lose it." He ended the call before Sung-ho could respond. The jet began its descent toward Marseille as dawn broke over the Mediterranean. Below, the city was waking, ordinary people living ordinary lives, untouched by the empires and territories and violence that had consumed Taehyung's existence. Somewhere down there, in a hospital he'd never seen, Amma Mensa was fighting for 4 lives he'd never known existed. And for the first time in his carefully constructed criminal career, Taehyung Chung understood a devastating truth. All his power, all his control, all his capacity for making men disappear and cities bend, none of it mattered. He couldn't intimidate biology. He couldn't threaten fate. He couldn't force forgiveness. The jet's wheels touched French soil, and Taehyung Chung, crime lord, empire builder, the man who controlled everything, felt utterly, completely powerless. St. Bridget's medical center smelled like antiseptic and beginnings. Taehyung moved through the corridors with the instinctive authority of a man accustomed to rooms parting before him. His suit was wrinkled from the flight, his jaw dark with stubble, but his presence still commanded attention, nurses glancing up, security guards straightening, the automatic deference given to dangerous men. None of it mattered. The maternity ward was on the 4th floor. Room 612. Through the rectangular window in the door, he saw her. Amma Mensa, hair braided tight against her skull, hospital gown soaked with sweat, her face a landscape of pain and determination. Her body curved protectively around the impossible, her hands gripping the bed rails like anchors. A nurse stood beside her, speaking softly, holding her through a contraction. No family. No partner. No one but strangers to witness the most terrifying moment of her life. Because of him. Taehyung pushed the door open. Amma's eyes snapped to his, and in them, he saw everything. Recognition. Fury. Fear. Not fear of him, but fear for what he represented. What he might take. Get out. Her voice was hoarse but absolute. Amma. You don't get to say my name anymore. Each word was a blade. You forfeited that right when you called me defective and walked away. He moved closer, his hands raised slightly, a gesture of peace he didn't know how to make convincing. Those are my children. The laugh that escaped her was short, bitter, devastating. No. Alma's eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him freeze. These are the children I carried alone after you decided my body was broken. These are the children I protected from you. These are mine. A contraction seized her then, violent and merciless. Her body arched, a gasp tearing from her throat. Taehyung moved instinctively, reaching for her hand. Don't touch me. She recoiled as if his proximity burned. Don't you dare touch me. The nurse, Marie, her name tag read, stepped between them, her small frame suddenly formidable. Sir, you need to leave. I'm the father. You're upsetting her. Marie's voice was professional but unyielding. Her blood pressure is spiking. You're endangering both her and the babies. I have a right. You have nothing. Alma's voice cut through the room like a judgment. You gave up your rights when you told me I was worthless. When you chose someone younger because I couldn't perform my basic purpose. She threw his own words back at him, each one landing like a physical blow. Taehyung's mouth opened, but nothing came out. What could he say? How could he defend the indefensible? Another contraction. Alma's scream filled the room, primal and terrifying. Alarms began beeping on the monitors. A doctor pushed past him, barely acknowledging his existence. Blood pressure's too high, someone said urgently. We need to prep for emergency cesarean. Marie turned to him, her patience exhausted. Sir. Leave. Now. Or I will call security. Taehyung looked at Alma, searching for something, understanding, permission, acknowledgement. Anything. She turned her face away from him. Remove him, she whispered. The words destroyed something fundamental in his chest. Marie gestured to the door, her expression no longer polite. You heard her. Taehyung Chang stood in the hallway outside room 612, his back against the wall, his hands shaking. Inside, he could hear the chaos of medical intervention, urgent voices, equipment moving, Alma's cries of pain rising and falling like waves. For lives being pulled into the world. His children. And he was standing in a hospital corridor, powerless. All his life, he'd wielded fear like a weapon. His name made men confess sins they hadn't committed. His silence ended negotiations. His presence in a room shifted the gravity of power. But here, in this fluorescent-lit hallway that smelled of disinfectant and hope, none of it mattered. He couldn't intimidate biology. He couldn't threaten love. He couldn't force his way into a room where a woman was protecting her children from the monster he'd become. Down the hall, a family celebrated, balloons, flowers, joy spilling through an open door. A father held his newborn with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face. Taehyung closed his eyes and slid down the wall until he was sitting on the cold linoleum floor. For the first time in 20 years, since his father had taught him that vulnerability was weakness, Taehyung Chang felt the full weight of what he'd lost. And he had absolutely no power to get it back. The doors to the operating room burst open. Taehyung stood as medical personnel rushed past him, equipment, urgency, the controlled chaos of an emergency cesarean. Through the brief opening, he saw Alma on the table, her body vulnerable under surgical lights, her eyes closed against the terror. The doors swung shut. He pressed his hand against the wall, his heart a war drum, and waited. The first cry pierced through the walls at 4:47 a.m. High. Fragile. Furious at being pulled into the world too soon. Taehyung's knees nearly buckled. A girl, he thought, though he had no way of knowing. The sound was so small, so impossibly alive, and it shattered something in his chest he hadn't known was still intact. 60 seconds later, the second cry. Stronger, deeper. Then the third, overlapping with the second, a duet of newborn rage and survival. 3 heartbeats turned to 3 voices. Taehyung's vision blurred. He pressed his forehead against the cold wall, his hands trembling, counting seconds that felt like eternities. 1 minute passed. 2. 3. No fourth cry. The silence was unbearable. Inside the operating room, he could hear Alma's voice, broken, pleading, please. Please, Where's my baby? Why isn't? Her sobs cut through the walls like violence. Taehyung pushed toward the doors, some primal instinct overriding everything else. A nurse intercepted him. Sir, you can't. My child isn't crying. His voice cracked on the last word. They're working on him. Please, you need to. The doors opened again. A doctor emerged, focused, moving fast but not panicked. Not yet. Behind her, Taehyung caught a glimpse of the scene, Amma's face twisted in anguish, surgical team surrounding a small blue form, hands working with practiced urgency. Breathe, someone commanded. Come on, baby. Breathe. Taehyung couldn't move. Couldn't breathe himself. Then, weak, stuttering, barely audible, the fourth cry. Amma's sob of relief was primal. The sound of a mother's heart restarting. Taehyung's legs gave out. He caught himself against the doorframe, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with something too large to name. 4 cries. 4 lives. 4 impossible miracles. They let him in afterward, he never knew why. Perhaps because Amma was too exhausted to fight anymore. Perhaps because some nurse took pity on the broken man in the expensive suit who looked like he'd aged a decade in an hour. Amma lay on the recovery bed, her face gray with exhaustion, her body trembling. The babies had been whisked away, too small, too early, fighting for every breath in the NICU. Taehyung approached slowly, carefully, like one might approach something sacred and fragile. Amma. Don't. Her voice was barely a whisper. Don't say anything. But then another wave of pain hit her, aftershocks, complications, her body's rebellion after the trauma. Her hand shot out, grasping blindly for something to anchor her. Taehyung's hand found hers before thought could intervene. She didn't pull away. Her grip was crushing, desperate, and he let her hurt him. Let her nails dig crescents into his skin. Let her pain become his because it was the only thing he could carry for her. When the contraction passed, she looked at their joined hands as if surprised to find them connected. They showed me, she whispered. Before they took them. 4 faces. So small. 2 boys, Taehyung's voice was raw. 2 girls. Kwame, Efua, Kojo, and Zuri. She spoke their names like prayers. I named them months ago. Names that mean strength. Survival. Not heirs, Taehyung realized with devastating clarity. Lives. Not extensions of his empire or proof of his virility or symbols of his legacy. For separate souls who would laugh and cry and dream and hurt. For people who deserved better than a father who measured worth in bloodlines and power. You can leave now, Amma said quietly, pulling her hand from his. You've seen them. You know they exist. That's all you get. I won't leave. That's not your choice. I know. He met her exhausted gaze. But I'm asking anyway. Let me stay. Not as their father, I know I haven't earned that. Just, let me stay. Amma closed her eyes, tears sliding down her temples. Why? Because leaving you 8 months ago was the worst decision of my life. The words came out broken, honest. And I won't make it twice. She didn't respond. Didn't accept him. Didn't forgive him. But she didn't call the nurse to remove him either. The NICU doors closed behind 4 incubators, each one holding a life too small, too early, fighting odds that terrified even the doctors. Taehyung stood on one side of the glass. Amma lay recovering on the other. And between them, in temperature-controlled boxes surrounded by monitors and tubes and machines breathing for lungs not quite ready. For children who had just shattered an empire with their first breaths. The NICU became Taehyung's entire world. He learned its rhythms, the shift changes at 7 and 7, the particular alarm that meant oxygen levels dropping, the way nurses moved with urgent calm when situations turned critical. He learned which coffee from the vending machine was least terrible, which chairs in the waiting area didn't destroy his back after hours of sitting, how to wash his hands so thoroughly that his skin cracked and bled. He learned their names. Kwame, firstborn by 90 seconds, the fighter. already trying to pull at his breathing tube with fingers smaller than Taehyung's thumb. Efua, quiet, watchful even in sleep. The nurses said she was the stable one, the one who'd probably go home first. Zuri, tiny, fierce, her cries the loudest despite being the smallest. 2 pounds, 4 ounces of pure determination. And Kojo. Kojo, who struggled. Day 3, the alarm screamed at 2 a.m. Taehyung was in the waiting room. He'd stopped leaving the hospital entirely, when nurses sprinted past. Through the NICU window, he saw the controlled chaos surrounding one incubator. Kojo's. His son couldn't breathe. Alma appeared beside him, her post-surgical body moving too fast, ignoring her own pain. Her hand pressed against the glass, her breath fogging it. No. No, no, no. Medical staff worked with practiced intensity, adjustments, medications, a breathing tube being repositioned. Minutes stretched into eternities. Then, the monitors stabilized. Alma collapsed against the wall, her legs giving out. Taehyung caught her before she hit the floor, and for once, she let him. Her body shook against his chest, sobs tearing through her. "It's my fault," she whispered. "My body couldn't carry them long enough. I failed them." "No." Taehyung's voice was fierce, his arms tightening around her. "Your body created miracles. For lives that shouldn't exist. You carried them as long as humanly possible. They're suffering because. They're alive because of you." He pulled back, forcing her to meet his eyes. "And they're fighting because you taught them how. Everything strong in them came from you." She stared at him, searching for the lie, the manipulation. "I'm the failure, Alma," he continued quietly. "I'm the one who called you broken when you were creating the impossible. I'm the one who made you feel you had to protect them from their own father." Something in her expression cracked, not forgiveness, but recognition. They stood there in the dim hallway, two people destroyed and rebuilding in the wreckage. He stayed. Day 5. Day 7. Day 10. His phone became a monument to the empire he was abandoning. Sung-ho's messages grew more desperate. "The Yakuza took the Incheon ports. Kim's syndicate is moving on our Seoul territories. Your father's old allies are calling you weak. If you don't come back now, there won't be anything to come back to." On day 12, Sung-ho called at midnight. Taehyung was sitting in the NICU, his finger in Kwame's tiny fist, when he answered. "It's over," Sung-ho said without preamble. "The Lee family moved on everything. They're offering to buy out your remaining assets at 30 cents on the dollar. If you don't return and fight, you lose it all." Through the incubator's plastic wall, Taehyung watched his son's chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance. So small. So fragile. So infinitely more important than shipping routes and territory. "Then I lose it," he said simply. "Taehyung, listen to yourself. This is insanity. You're throwing away everything your father built. My father built an empire on fear and violence. He died alone, hated, with a legacy that meant nothing." Taehyung's voice was quiet but absolute. "I won't do the same. You're choosing her over everything. I'm choosing them. And yes. That's exactly what I'm doing." He ended the call and turned off his phone. Alma found him in the NICU at dawn, still sitting beside Kwame's incubator, his expensive suit wrinkled beyond repair, his eyes red from exhaustion he refused to acknowledge. "You're still here," she said softly. "Yes. Sung-ho came by yesterday. He said your empire is collapsing." Taehyung didn't look away from his son. "It is. And you're staying anyway." "Yes." Silence stretched between them, but it felt different now. Less hostile. More uncertain, like the first thaw after a brutal winter. "Why?" Alma's voice broke on the word. Finally, he looked at her. His face was open in a way she'd never seen, no armor, no calculation, just raw truth. "Because 8 months ago, I chose power over love and lost everything that mattered. I won't make that mistake again. Even if you never forgive me. Even if they never know my name. I'm staying. Alma studied him for a long moment, this man who'd destroyed her, who was now destroying himself, who sat vigil over children he'd never planned to have with a devotion that terrified her. I don't trust you, she said finally. I know. I may never trust you. I know. But... She looked through the glass at 4 tiny lives fighting for their futures. You can stay. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love. But it was a beginning. And for Taehyung Chung, it was more than he deserved. They had the conversation in the hospital chapel, neutral ground, empty at 3 in the morning, the only place they could speak without nurses or alarms or the weight of 4 lives listening. Alma sat in the front pew, her posture careful around her healing incision. Taehyung sat 2 feet away, close enough to hear, far enough to respect the distance she needed. I need you to understand something, Alma began, her voice steady despite the exhaustion carved into her face. What we had? It's gone. You killed it when you called me defective. When you chose someone younger because I couldn't perform my basic purpose. Each word landed precisely, deliberately. Taehyung nodded, not defending himself, not making excuses. I don't love you anymore, she continued. I don't know if I even like you. And I definitely don't trust you. I understand. Do you? She turned to face him fully. Because staying here, sitting by their incubators, crying when Kojo stopped breathing, that doesn't erase 8 months. It doesn't undo what you said. It doesn't make you their father. I know. His voice was quiet, stripped of everything but truth. But I'm asking for the chance to become someone who could be. Eventually. Maybe. Alma studied him for a long moment, weighing something he couldn't see. If you want any part of their lives, she said finally, there are rules. Non-negotiable boundaries. Break them once, and you're gone permanently. Tell me. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, she'd written them down, he realized. Prepared for this conversation with the precision of someone who'd learned not to trust promises. First, no intimidation. Ever. You don't use your name, your reputation, or your connections to control situations involving our children. You don't make people afraid to protect them. Agreed. Second, no criminal influence. Whatever you are, whatever empire you built, it stays away from them. They don't grow up in your world. They don't inherit your violence. Taehyung's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Agreed. Third, I have final say in everything. Medical decisions, education, where we live, who they're around. You can have opinions, but I decide. Always. This one hurt more. The loss of control, the admission that he'd forfeited the right to equal partnership. But he'd done this to himself. Agreed. Fourth, her voice softened slightly. You walk away from everything. The criminal empire, the violence, all of it. You become someone our children can be proud of, or you don't become anything to them at all. I've already started. He met her eyes. Sung-ho is dismantling what's left. Transferring assets, settling debts, closing operations. By next month, there won't be an empire to inherit. And then what? Alma's question was genuine, curious. Who are you without power? I don't know. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. But I'd like the chance to find out. She told him about Daniel Mensah on day 15. Her cousin, Ghanaian French, mid-40s, running a legitimate private security firm based in Lyon. Corporate protection, risk assessment, nothing that involved breaking kneecaps or controlling ports. He needs someone with your particular skill set, Alma said carefully. They were in the NICU, watching Efua sleep peacefully. Strategy, threat analysis, understanding how dangerous people think. The skills without the violence. You're offering me a job. Taehyung couldn't hide his surprise. I'm offering you a possibility. She adjusted Efua's blanket through the incubator's portal. Daniel knows your history. He's skeptical. But he's willing to meet you because I asked. Why would you do that? Alma was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on the incubator's edge. Because our children deserve a father who works, who contributes, who doesn't sit around mourning his lost empire. And because... She paused, choosing words carefully. Because I've watched you these past 2 weeks. You've been humble when you could have been angry. Patient when you could have been demanding. Present when it would have been easier to leave. I'm not leaving. I know. She looked at him then, really looked. That's why I'm giving you this chance. That night, Taehyung stood at the hospital window overlooking Marseille. Behind him lay the ruins of everything he'd built, the territories lost, the respect evaporated, the fear-based empire crumbling into dust. Ahead lay uncertainty. A modest job. A life where his name meant nothing. For children who might never call him father. A woman who might never forgive him. No power. No control. No empire. Just the possibility of becoming someone worth knowing. Taehyung pressed his forehead against the cool glass and made his choice. Not the choice to reclaim what he'd lost. Not the choice to rebuild his empire. But the choice to become someone his children, if they ever accepted him, wouldn't need to be protected from. For the first time in his life, Taehyung Chang chose humility over dominance. And somehow, impossibly, it felt like winning. The meeting took place in a private room at the Grand Hotel du in Lyon, neutral territory, expensive enough to command respect, public enough to prevent bloodshed. Taehyung sat at the head of the table one last time, facing the faces of men who'd built fortunes on his decisions. Sung-ho to his right, pale with disbelief. Across from him, representatives from the Lee family, the Yakuza, the Kim syndicate, vultures who'd been circling for weeks, waiting for him to falter. Gentlemen, Taehyung began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd once made cities bend. I'm done. Silence. Then laughter, sharp, disbelieving. You're negotiating, Lee Sang-min said, leaning back with a predator's smile. This is a play for better terms. It's not. Taehyung slid a folder across the table. Asset transfers, territory concessions, operational handovers. Everything documented, legally binding. I'm walking away. Sung-ho's hand trembled slightly as he distributed copies. His eyes met Taehyung's, a silent plea to reconsider, to remember who they'd been, what they'd built. Taehyung looked away. The Incheon ports go to the Nakamura Gumi, he continued, his tone clinical, detached. Seoul territory split between Lee and Kim families. European operations dissolve, I'm selling the legitimate fronts, liquidating the rest. My network contacts, my protection agreements, my leverage, all of it ends today. Why? The question came from Nakamura's representative, genuine confusion in his voice. You're still young. You could rebuild. This is insanity. Taehyung smiled without humor. Yes. I've been told. Lee Sang-min leaned forward, eyes narrowing. What's the catch? What do you want in return? Nothing. The word felt like freedom. Just your agreement not to follow me. Not to involve me in future conflicts. I'm out. Completely. No one just walks away from this life, another voice said, suspicious. I am. The room erupted in arguments, accusations, theories. But Taehyung sat still, unmoved by the chaos he'd once orchestrated so carefully. These men still believed power was everything, territory, fear, control. They'd never understand that he'd found something those things couldn't buy. For tiny heartbeats in a hospital NICU. One woman who'd survived him and might, possibly, let him try to become better. This is about the woman, Sung-ho said quietly, bitterly. The ex-wife. Yes. And the children. Yes. You're choosing them over everything we built. Taehyung met his oldest friend's eyes. I'm choosing them over everything we destroyed to build it. The meeting ended 2 hours later with signatures, transfers, and the quiet understanding that Taehyung Chang was either the smartest man in the room or completely insane. They let him walk out alive because they believed the latter. Maybe they were right. Outside, Sung-ho caught his arm one final time. You'll regret this, he said, not angry anymore, just sad. When the money runs out. When you're ordinary. When she still doesn't love you. You'll remember what you gave up. Taehyung thought of Kojo's first independent breath 3 days ago. The way Zuri wrapped her impossibly small fingers around his thumb. Kwame's fierce determination to survive. Efua's quiet strength. Maybe, he admitted. But I'll never regret trying. He walked away from his empire, his identity, his father's ghost. And he didn't look back. 6 weeks later, in Marseille. The apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that barely fit 2 people, walls thin enough to hear neighbors arguing. Nothing like the penthouses Taehyung had owned, the luxury he'd commanded. It was perfect. Evening light filtered through cheap curtains. Alma sat on the worn couch, Efua sleeping against her shoulder, exhaustion and contentment mixing on her face. The twins, Kwame and Zuri, dozed in their shared bassinet by the window. Taehyung stood in the small kitchen, Kojo sleeping on his chest, one hand supporting the tiny body, the other stirring formula with the careful precision he'd learned from YouTube videos and patient nurses. His son's heartbeat pulsed against his palm, steady now, strong. He's gaining weight, Alma said softly, not wanting to wake Efua. 1 ounce this week. Taehyung couldn't keep the pride from his voice. You remembered his feeding schedule. I set 17 alarms. The smallest smile touched her lips, not forgiveness, not yet, but something softer than the walls she'd built. This life had no empire. No fear-based respect. No power beyond the ordinary human struggle of feeding schedules and diaper changes and learning how to soothe 4 different cries. Taehyung Chang had once controlled cities. Now